Let's move on to the first video, which gives you an introduction to AWS. In this video, we are going to take a look at Lambda usage and pay-per-use pricing, and I show you where to find documentation and other developer resources. We are now on the landing page for all things Lambda, aws.amazon.com/lambda. Let's head over to the documentation page. The documentation page gives you links to many useful resources such as SDKs and tools. But for now, let's take a look into the developer guide. The developer guide gives us a lot of useful background information on how Lambda works. Let's take a look into the section Building Applications with AWS Lambda and click on Event Source Mapping. If we scroll down a little bit, we see an example of how you can use Lambda. In this example, Amazon S3 pushes events and invokes a Lambda function. Amazon S3 is the simple storage service, which is a scalable web service for storing large amounts of data and retrieving large amounts of data. In this example, we have a user who uploads a file into an Amazon S3 bucket. This triggers an object created event. The object created event is detected by Amazon S3, upon which S3 invokes our Lambda function. The Lambda function is associated with an execution role. We'll come later to that. The execution role gives or sets certain permissions. So in this scenario, Amazon S3 needs to have permissions to invoke our Lambda function. Otherwise, any other service would be able to invoke our Lambda function, which we might want to avoid. So if these permissions are given, our Lambda function is invoked with the event data from our Amazon S3 service invocation. This is also referred to as the push event model, but there's also another way to use AWS Lambda. Let's scroll down a little bit to the next example. Here we have a stream-based service. In this example, Lambda pulls events from an Amazon Kinesis stream and invokes a Lambda function. On the left-hand side, you see a custom application which writes data on a Kinesis stream. On the right-hand side, our Lambda function continuously picks up pieces or records from this stream. Again, we have an execution role associated with our Lambda function, but in this case it works the other way around. In this case, we need to give our Lambda function permission to access the Kinesis stream, because here we are in the so-called pull event model. Whenever we pick up a new record, the Lambda function is executed. Now let's take a quick look at cloud service pricing. Cloud services work quite differently from traditional web hosting, and this also applies to pricing. With a traditional web hoster, you typically sign up for a long-term contract, maybe 1 year or 2 years, and you pay for the resources whether you use them or not. With cloud services, it works quite differently. With cloud services, you only pay for the resources that you actually use on a very fine granularity basis. The downside of this is that the pricing model becomes a bit more complicated. As you can see on this page, each Amazon Web Service has its individual pricing model. Typically, it breaks down into charges for compute capacity, storage capacity, and data transfer that you use. Let's take a closer look at the pricing model of AWS Lambda. The pricing model breaks down into 2 parts. First, you pay for requests, and this is actually quite cheap. It's only 20 cents for 1 million requests, or this super small amount of money per request. The other thing that you pay for is duration, which is the time that your Lambda function runs. And this time period is rounded up to the nearest 100 milliseconds. So if you have a short-running Lambda function, which runs only for 50 milliseconds, you pay for 100. If you have a Lambda function which runs for 910 milliseconds, you pay for 1 full second. And you also have to pay for the amount of memory that you allocate to your function. So you can configure your Lambda function with different levels of memory. And then you get charged this fixed price constant for every gigabyte second that you use. Let's take a quick look at a sample calculation. In this example, you configure your Lambda function with half a gig of memory, and we assume that the Lambda function is called 3 million times within 1 month. Each Lambda function, we assume, runs for 1 second. Then our monthly compute charges would be calculated as follows. First, we need to calculate the total amount of time that our Lambda function is running. 3 million invocations times 1 second per invocation amounts to 3 million seconds. Then we calculate the compute capacity that is used during these invocations. So we use Lambda functions for 3 million seconds, and each Lambda function is allocated with half a gig of memory, so we use 1.5 gigabyte seconds. Amazon Lambda comes with a free tier, so up to a certain level you get compute capacity and requests for free. So you deduct these from your calculation and you end up with 1.1 gigabyte seconds. You multiply that with your fixed price constant and you end up with roughly $18 per month. But you also have to pay for request charges. However, this is only 20 cents per million requests, and the first million requests is free, so you have to pay for 2 million requests, and this is just 40 cents. So your final calculation amounts to roughly $19 per month. In the next video, we are going to walk through the AWS Web Dashboard, the so-called Management Console. Stay tuned!